I'm live. Am I live? All right. Yeah, I'm trying a new system, so I have no idea if it's going to work, but I think it might be working because I can see a little icon over there. My face. It says live. It says it's got a little eye, so people might be watching. So yeah. My gosh. All right. So this is high tech sit here in the virology lab. A virology studio. It's not a lab. It's sometimes a lab, but generally speaking, it's a studio. So if you can hear me, that's unbelievable. If you can't hear me, then this technology is not for me. But let me know if you can. I'm not even sure if you can try and put comments if you can, so I can see if this is working. I got a thumbs up, which means I think it means it's working. So that's terrific to hear. So it's my face. I'm just going to give you all my technical woes. My face is rather small over there. I can see a tiny thumbnail talking, and I think that thumbnail is me. I have given myself the name Jacob Nim for some bizarre reason that I cannot explain. So you don't have to call me Jacob Nim, but for some reason I wanted to call myself Jacob Nim. Jacob Nim. I don't know. It just sounded so wise. Yeah. And I think for tonight's conversation, I wanted to come across as wise. So will I pull that off? There's another question. So here we are. Hang on, I've pushed the wrong button. So here we are at in my studio, and the last couple of days I've been always trying to come up with things to talk about, and this idea, it's not even an idea that hit me. I suddenly became self-conscious. I thought, I'm presenting myself as the what's the word? The level-headed, the reasonable, the scientist. Sometimes dipping a little bit into my art, but essentially doing my level best to come across as level-headed and intelligent, as my old professor used to say. At best, semi-intelligent. I like to think he was joking, but you'll have to ask him. But the thing that had been getting to me was this idea of a fact. Like, I suddenly thought, I'm using facts, talking about facts, and I suddenly thought, well, what is a fact? Like, are the facts that a scientist talks about, are they somehow different to the facts that people who are not, necessarily scientists, are they different to those facts? And very nice, they questions that felt they weren't even 2 o'clock in the morning questions. This was at a reasonable hour in the morning. I was thinking, facts, yeah. What, for heaven's sake, what is a fact? Ironically, it's not even a question that you ask yourself that much as a scientist. It's not even, it's you deal, I think, in things that you call facts, but what are these things? So I put a list together, and I hope that the slideshow is, I can't show full screen because my technology can't handle that, but I asked a few questions, and these were literally the questions that sort of came at me. And they're a little bit tongue in cheek, but they're also not, because we give them some kind of weight in our lives, right? What does a fact look like? Can you hold a fact? I mean, can you hold a fact? Is a fact true? Like, what, we start getting into some pretty hectic philosophy when we start asking, is a fact actually true? Because then we have to deal with what truth is, right? When does something become a fact? Like, at what point in the evolution of an idea, or whatever this thing is that we're banding about, this fact, when does it actually become a fact? And another thing I just thought was really kind of, curious is a fact symmetrical? Depending on how you hold the fact, does it stay the same fact? Does it stay as true as it was as when you're looking at it from a different point of view? How stable is a fact? Do we believe facts? What does it mean to believe? I'll give you an example. Let's take, you may recall 2 nights ago, I spoke about Alexander von Humboldt. Where is it? Doesn't matter. And how he, he really brought to the world, to the life sciences, as it was then the newly forming life sciences, this idea that things are relational, right? That we're not machines, or nature isn't a machine, or the universe isn't necessarily a machine. It's every part of it. This is probably more true for living things than it is for the universe, but let's not go there right now. But every part of a living system is influenced and is not necessarily more important than any other part. It works as a whole. The sum is greater than the whole. That kind of thinking. Now, is that a fact? And I think now, so just to kind of give you my sense of when I was almost frantically trying to come to grips with this idea of a fact, I thought to myself, what actually makes it a fact? He must have observed something, and then a little bit later, through that observation, came to believe something, and I guess through some kind of feedback thing, observations came to reinforce his belief. But a belief is something else. A belief isn't necessarily based on facts, but it might be influenced by facts. So, this is probably something to take with us, because I think it'll become relevant later on in the evening, is that, some people will, irrespective of what evidence, and maybe evidence is a baby fact, I don't know, what evidence is presented to them, they won't change their belief. That's what you call a fundamentalist. I think in the age of COVID-19, those will be conspiracy theorists. They've got something they're really holding on truly to, and in the face of evidence, they will not change their beliefs. And worse than that, they will use whatever facts they have available to reinforce their beliefs. Now they'll use facts to enforce their beliefs. Now, isn't that interesting? How can you use a fact to enforce something that isn't necessarily true? So there's something about fundamentalists out there that are immune to facts, right? So this is the kind of thinking that I was having. And the artist in me tried to get to grips with what a fact might look like, all right? And I remember this is an artistic interpretation. Part of the way that I try and solve problems is by I try and be as rational as I possibly can, but eventually things like facts, which are really quite mysterious to me. Maybe they shouldn't be, but at this point in the process, I was feeling slightly mystified by them. So another way that I engage with an idea is through a drawing. So I drew this drawing over here of a bird, and I thought maybe that's what a fact looks like. It's made up of little factoids, little things that interact to form a whole thing that has some kind of form in the world that is separate, that is contained. Maybe that's what a fact is. How stable is this bird? How stable is this fact? What is it subject to? Along those lines, I developed a short animation, again, trying to probe this idea using the tools and mechanisms of a more artistically inclined nature. So I looked at this and I thought, there's my fact. And what happens when it gets prodded and pried and analyzed? What is its stability like? What happens to the components of this fact? Do they remain stable, static? Does the fact lose form? Can a fact lose form? Is it a stable entity? What is this thing called a fact? So yeah, in this, I wouldn't call it cynical, but certainly there's an evolution of this fact. And maybe it's been disrupted, and maybe it's been challenged, but somehow it's been transformed into something else. This is artistic speculation, but it helps me kind of get my head around these things. This is playing with that same idea, the tension between a fact, evidence, things we can hold onto. I haven't even yet defined facts, and I'm talking about evidence. But there's a tension between fact and what we believe. And I think we've sort of touched on that a bit. But let's get now to some stuff that's a bit, this has been, let's call it mildly esoteric, okay? A level of esoteria that we should be able to cope with. All right, so let's, now we're going to get into the actual stuff of what's in the media, what's in the news, what's in the scientific publications. because we're going to try and use that to try and establish what I think at least a working definition of what a fact is. All right. So out there in the media, there are these rather wild, and I get them on my Facebook feed all the time from various people who I will say, some of them I really respect a lot, like some artist colleagues of mine, I think are phenomenal artists, great thinkers in many areas, but then that seem to also be buying into ideas that seem to me wild and without much foundation. Why? How does that happen? What's going on there? So that is what I want to share with you quickly. So there was this really interesting, well, it's not interesting, but it's come up a couple of times, this idea that, this is the website I found it on, so it's a real fundamentalist kind of, and look, it's a Christian fundamentalist, all religions have their fundamentalism, so it just had, this one happened to be on a Christian site, very fundamentalist site, but it was, you know, the title there is shocking, historian exposes Bill Gates, yada, yada, yada. We all know Bill Gates, who I don't think is evil by any stretch of the imagination, but this one was actually about using, you know, it's the three musketeers, Bill Gates and Anthony Fauci and you know, all in this big conspiracy to kind of put vaccines in us which carry chips. I mean, some wild stuff. I don't watch them fully because I find them, it's a drain on my brain. It's literally a drain on my brain. But this one spoke specifically about Anthony Fauci, right? Said, Dr. Anthony Fauci. Have I got the picture? And it's a classic expose that a lot of these videos are using, where Sir Anthony Fauci says there will be a massive outbreak during the next 2 years, huge outbreak. And I thought, so that's a fact. He did say that because I went to the video, I watched him say it at the Georgetown University conference of epidemiology conference about pandemics and epidemics and all that. He did say it. He actually said, what happens if you the whole thing, the published papers that he has published to try and understand. This is just an image. What you're seeing over here is just an image of him at Georgetown giving that talk. That's what the actual mouth looked like when it said that dastardly thing about the every 2 years is going to, well, this in 2 years' time there's going to be this massive outbreak, or in a very short period of time. So go to the publications. This was around 2017, and he's been doing this periodically, publishes work along these lines. The paper that spoke about these, which gave credence to what he was saying, was The Challenge, and it's published in Nature, which is a very highly rated journal. Challenge of Emerging and Re-emerging Infectious Diseases was the essay that he wrote with a couple of colleagues. And in that paper, you know, he just shows that it's entirely true that every 2 or 3 years, the world has to ready itself for some outbreak, which is either a new thing that's never been seen. In that case, it was just 10 years after the AIDS pandemic. So he was at the real coal face of that. And, you know, he put together a table and this graphic showing that periodically, every 2 years, there's a newly emerging or a re-emerging pathogen, bacteria or a virus that could go global. Okay, doesn't always. Some don't take. AIDS was like, you know, he used the word slow burn. It quietly just went global. All right. COVID, SARS-CoV-2 is not so quietly going global, and there's many others. Like there's the classic examples, and I think this is really compelling, and has such, you know, just like CoV-2 has gone global, influenza can form a much more virulent. Now we talk about flu having a 0.2% mortality rate. That's true, but that's the flu that's currently there. A lot of the flus, like the avian flus, have a much higher mortality rate, but some of the avian flu, some of the combinations of flu, but they struggle to get out of a chicken into a human. They can get into a human, but the human-to-human transmission is very unlikely or hasn't really been seen, okay? It's a bit like MERS, a bit like that Middle Eastern coronavirus. It gets from a camel into a human, but it struggles to get from a human to a human. But because of the high mutation rates of these viruses, and because of the number of chickens, and because of the size and scale of the poultry industry, they do recognize that it is only a matter of time. That's why they cull these massive, they cull all the chickens when this sort of thing happens. So farming practices, they look at all sorts of things like farming practices and our agricultural use are potentially great reservoirs for newly emerged pathogens. And yeah, you can see 97, 99, 2003, 2004, potential. That's what Anthony Fauci was saying in that video. He wasn't saying, he says, you better watch it. There's going to be a pandemic that who's ever in charge is going to have to be thinking very carefully about. It's going to be an issue. When flu came out during this period here, who was in charge? I think that was Clinton, maybe. He would have been worried. He would have had his people keeping an eye on that because that could go global. That's just the way it is, all right? So that is what I'm getting at there about a fact is, yes, he did say that. That is entirely true. And that fact, the meaning behind that fact, the information that pads that piece of data makes the fact of that there's going to be a pandemic a probabilistic fact, okay? What is that a thing? Can a fact be something that's not necessary to, but could be true? So remember what science is, and this is really important. Science, especially the empirical, like when you with viruses, the empirical sciences all deal with the gradual minimization of uncertainty, the gradual accumulation of facts into a coherent theory. Let me take you back to my bird. Makes me think now my bird is a reasonably good model for what a fact is. You're building up coherent theory by putting more and more facts into that story, more and more bits of evidence. Evidence are things that we test. We can test by experiment. We test by observation. And if those observations measure up, we add that into the pile to build up that beautiful image of the bird. And maybe that bird is slightly shaped by a belief about what it's going to look like eventually. We want it to be a beautiful bird, but it's an interaction between the information that we acquire from our observations and our measurements and the overall ideas we have in our head about this, because it's a human endeavor. We are full of ideas and beliefs and things, and these things are in tension. This is not a perfect thing. This is not Plato's world, right? This is not, there is an absolute ultimate truth underneath it all. This is empirically gained knowledge and wisdom. This is what's important. So let's see. So that is the story of the Fauci story and why he said what he said and why it's not a conspiracy, right? So that's, I've just said this now, the empirical sciences like virology, theoretical sciences are very different. A lot of the great theoretical physicists, absolutely, Roger Penrose, great mathematician, believes that the fundamental truth underneath it all is reality, is an equation, is some perfection of maths. This guy here, Frank Wilczek, if you can see that, he won the Nobel Prize for Physics. Gosh, where's the camera? He won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 2006, I think it was, for his work on something to do with quantum physics. But he absolutely has written this whole massive book, motivating. Underneath it all is this perfection. That's theoretical. We don't know if that's true. He used a lot of empirical studies to try and go in that direction, which delivered a lot of very powerful knowledge. Built up his bird that way. All right. So just again, let's take another quick look at the science of virology. So let's look at the fact of a virus. Like a virus is a fact. I mean, you can hold a virus, but wait. Where did a virus come from? It was first defined and discovered because an infectious agent was able to pass through a filter. You know, like this is a very specialized filter. It happened to be porcelain, but basically they used to use these filters to pass they're looking for infectious agents. They would pass it through a filter, and usually what would happen is the infectious agent would not be able to pass through the filter, so they'd be able to retain it. But they were discovering that there were things so small that they were passing through the filter and able to cause an infection. They called those things viruses. They didn't know anything else about it. A filterable infectious agent used to be what a virus was. That was the fact of a virus. As we learned more, now we've discovered when we go into nature and literally take samples of soil and samples of animal tissue and subject it to massive new technology of sequencing all the information out there that is genetic, you come up with a large presence of virus-like genes. Those things aren't viruses, are they? But they're now lumped into, adding to the story, adding to the fact of a virus, that also environmental genetic information that looks virus-like could also be a virus. So we're extending the fact of a virus. We're extending our understanding of a virus. Added to that now, if you look in our genomes, in our chromosomes, you will see lots of evidence that during our past, there must have been vast numbers of viruses that were infecting us. We see evidence in our DNA. Those viruses aren't filterable. They don't even necessarily live. They are sitting there dormant. Not dormant that they're going to wake up, dormant because they can no longer wake up. They've lost function. But those are now part of the story of viruses, contributing to understand. So there it is, adding bits of evidence, bits of information, some of it completely in line with the original definition, some quite not, but definitely adding to this greater story, adding up to build this beautiful bird that we're trying to make to understand our virus. Right. I wanted to talk about one last piece of evidence, all right? Again, to help us understand this idea of mutations, of facts. So this is a paper that's a friend of mine who's at Columbia University. He showed me this paper, which I think it's also a preprint, so it's not published. Again, that's another thing. The results of the study, we'll be hard pressed to call a fact until our peers have gotten together and kind of voted for whether this is true or not. Okay, so that gives you another little insight into how slippery, how really slippery a fact is. So facts seem to be these things that are really kind of there, but they're slippery at the edges. They become unstable at their edges. So the bird is not, it's porous. They're very porous things. The edges change. The definitions are fluid. All right, we have to come to terms with that uncertainty. That is a huge part of what all of this is about. Okay, so this study comes out and it says they basically looked, and they've done an amazing job here. There's a website called GISAID, all right, GISAID, and what they do is they accumulate every time a coronavirus is isolated and sequenced, where they get the genetic information. They put it on and they see how it fits together with a whole population of viruses that are not isolated. That's all good and well. We can learn about the different clusters of virus. We see that they don't change all that much. But this paper argues that if it follows a certain criteria, okay, so they looked at a whole lot of sequence. They asked themselves this: if they see amongst these sequences all these different viruses, and you must remember there are thousands of them that they've actually looked at that level, if they see a high frequency of sequences that exhibit certain mutations, the same changes in the same region, geography, in the same town or the same city or the same, geographical location, that suggests that those they've come about quite quickly, they've spread quite quickly over a short area, small area. They must therefore be quite important for the virus, all right? That is evidence. That's the wrong word. That is a strong suggestion. So see, use words like suggestion of evidence for this being beneficial to the virus, that these mutations are somehow beneficial. They also say if you get the same mutation happening in different ways, that's extremely unlikely by chance. So it also is inferring evidence or suggesting evidence that this is now selected, positive selection. So the reason first of all, it's a really interesting study, and it's a good study to look at, because it does suggest there are clusters of mutants out there which are fitter, okay, which are more spreadable. Don't know if they make you sicker, but they spread faster. So there's selection for them, selection to transmit faster. We don't know, but that aside, think about what that means in terms of contributing to the body of evidence. It's a proto fact, maybe. It's a baby fact, like it's a fact waiting to happen. It needs to be peer reviewed. There's lots of ways in the field of mutagenesis and population genetics. There's a lot of theory which is hotly debated still. So there's room for argument, and that's why other pieces of evidence have to come in to contribute to that understanding. Perhaps the bigger word was when the fact transforms into a theory, which is a body of lots of different ideas and pieces of evidence that tell a certain coherent story. Then it becomes perhaps a theory. So many facts together contribute towards a theory. But every one of those is subject to its own nuances. So that brings me essentially to all I wanted to say. Last but not least, I did this drawing on the computer last night, which I thought this gets to something about what the world of the fact. I call it the body of knowledge. This is the body of knowledge. Right down here, we have this thing which is that's reality, right? That's a thing we've never seen, okay? Excuse me a sec. We have never seen reality. It is not available to us, okay? We've got 5 senses with which we try and perceive the world. We've got this interface in our brains which tell us what we think the world is, but we've never actually seen what it really looks like, or what it is. Looking is the wrong word, what it actually is. Okay, we don't know. We hope that the facts we come up with are at least dipping their tentative toes into this reality, if not explaining exactly what it is, because they don't stand a chance of doing that. We hope they are dipping their toes into that reality, giving us some sense, some relationship, or inferring something about that reality, even if it's just some kind of reflection of it. And these things together form our theories, all right? Now, the most important thing about a theory is that these facts should interact with each other, and they should cohere, right? They should be coherent. They should make sense within each other. What starts to happen, if that stops to happen, very often, I haven't drawn it here, you'll get what's called a paradigm shift. Some of those facts start to conflict with a theory. At some point, you've got to abandon your theory, all right? Or broaden it, depending on which way you want to go. Science is a very human enterprise, and it's not cast in stone, and it's an evolving thing. And that's why this peer review process is so important. That's why active discussions, active knowledge must be constantly fought over. You know, scientists must hope that their ideas can be trashed, because that means their ideas are trashable. That means their ideas can be refuted. Okay, and that's a really important thing. A lot of what's happening in some aspects of theoretical physics is some of the ideas are so fantastic and fascinating, but they cannot ever be tested. All right, multiverses, string theory, it's a whole other discussion. But that's what I wanted to say tonight for the anatomy of fact. Do we know more about what a fact is? I hope we've been able to dip our toes into the world of a fact, swim around with these birds a bit, the bird of knowledge, shall we call it? And yes, I haven't really been able to follow this whole thing because I've been using this StreamYard. So I hope that went over all right. All the best to you.